The train from Denver pulled into Cheyenne 13 minutes late. Harlan Wade had been standing on the platform for 20 of those minutes, and the cold was starting to get into his boots. He had a ranch 12 mi out of town, a bunk house full of men who needed feeding, and a kitchen that had been cold since March. He was not a man who sent for things easily. It had taken him 4 months to write that letter to the placement agency in Denver and another 2 weeks to talk himself out of burning their reply. The letter had been simple enough. Experienced housekeeper, widowed preferred, willing to relocate, private room and board, fair wage. He had not written lonely, but he supposed the agency knew how to read between the lines. He watched the train empty itself onto the platform. A drummer with a sample case, a young lawyer type with soft hands, 3 ranchers from further north who nodded at Harlan and kept walking. And then a woman stepped off the train with a carpet bag in each hand, and a boy on each side of her and 2 more boys behind those, and she moved through the platform crowd the way a river moves through rock, not fast, but certain. She stopped in front of him. She was not what he had pictured. He had pictured someone older, rounder, someone who smelled like bread. This woman was 30-some with dark hair pulled back hard from her face and eyes that had already taken his measure and were working on their verdict. "Mr. Wade," she said, not a question. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, "these are my sons." She didn't say their names yet. She just let the 4 of them stand there. The oldest nearly as tall as Harlan, the youngest with a gap where his front teeth should have been, and she watched Harlan's face. He looked at the boys. He looked at her. He said the agency didn't mention 4. The agency, Clara Bennett said evenly, mentioned whatever the agency chose to mention. I told them 4. Whatever they wrote in their letter to you is between you and them. Harlan looked at her for a moment. He said, "Can you cook for 8 men?" She said, "I can cook for 12. He picked up one of her carpet bags, wagons out front. She picked up the other one before he could reach it. That was how it started. Neither of them in that first exchange thought to ask the question that would have saved them both a considerable amount of confusion over the next 3 weeks. Harlan Wade had hired a housekeeper. Clara Bennett had been told she was going to be a wife. The agency, it would later become clear, had written 2 different letters. The ride out to the ranch took 2 hours. Ben, the 9-year-old, talked for most of it. He told Harlan about the train from Kansas City, about a man on the train who had a parrot, about the parrot saying something that made a woman faint, about the conductor and what he'd said about the parrot. Harlan listened. He did not talk much himself, but he had always found that some people filled silence like water fills a hole, and that there was a certain comfort in it. Sam, the youngest, fell asleep against his mother's arm before they reached the county road. Jake, the oldest, sat in the back of the wagon and watched the back of Harlan's head the way a man watches a card player he doesn't trust. Luke, the 12-year-old, watched everything and said nothing. Clara sat beside Harlan on the bench and looked at the land. Wyoming in late September had a particular quality of light, flat, and gold and going fast. The grass was already going brown. The mountains to the west held their snow like a promise that winter was not joking this year. "It's a working ranch," Harlan said after they'd been riding a while. "I assumed," Clara said. "Cattle mostly, some horses. I've got 7 men in the bunkhouse, 1 cook who quit in March. The house has been in poor condition since then." "I'll manage. The boys can bunk in the room off the barn. There's a curtain." "The boys stay with me," Clara said quietly. "No argument in it, just fact." Harlan looked at the road ahead. "There's only 1 extra room in the house." "Then that's where we'll be." He didn't push it. He'd learn over the next several days that pushing Clara Bennett on a thing she'd already decided was like pushing a fence post. It didn't move, and you hurt your hands. They came over the rise, and the ranch appeared below them. The main house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the holding pens, the water tower Harlan had built the summer before last. It wasn't elegant, but it was solid. Everything on it he had built or fixed himself. Sam woke up when the wagon stopped. He looked at the house. He looked at Harlan. He said, "Is this ours now?" Clara's jaw tightened slightly. "It's Mr. Wade S." Sam considered this. "Can I see the horses?" Harlan climbed down from the wagon. "After supper." Sam nodded seriously as though this were a business arrangement he found acceptable. Then he held up his arms to be lifted down. He looked at Harlan when he did it, not at his moth. At Harlan. Harlan picked him up and set him on the ground. It was such a small thing he would think about it later and not know what to make of it. But that was the moment. Sam's arms in the air, absolute and certain that something shifted, quiet as a door that swings open on its own. The kitchen was worse than Clara had expected. There was a layer of grease on the stove top that had developed its own character. The flour barrel had been left open and had guests. The good skillet was under the table for reasons no one could explain. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway the morning after they arrived, looked at all of it, and rolled up her sleeves. Luke appeared beside her. He was her quiet one, her observer. He looked at the kitchen the way she had. He said, "I'll take the grease pan outside." "Get Ben to help you," she said. "Tell him he can talk while he does it." Luke allowed himself a small smile and went to find his brother. Harlan's ranch hands were named Dale, Pete, Crockett, Sorensen, two brothers called simply the Mays, and a boy of about 17 named Hobb, who had been hired in the spring and seemed to be everywhere at once without ever being quite where he was needed. They were wary of Clara the way ranch hands are wary of a woman who appears in a domestic space that has been entirely masculine, not unfriendly, just watchful. On the second morning, Clara put breakfast on the table at 5:45. Eggs, salt pork, biscuits, and coffee that was hot and actual. Dale took one sip, set the cup down, and said, "Lord Almighty." Sorensen said, "Don't blaspheme." Dale said that was a prayer. The hands after that were entirely on her side. Jake was not on anyone's side. He was 15 and carried it like a weight. The age, the responsibility, the consciousness of being the man of a family that didn't have one. He had been this way since his father died 2 years back. Clara understood it. She didn't try to soften him. What she hadn't expected was Harlan. Harlan did not try to win Jake over. He did not compliment him or make conversation or offer to teach him things in a pointed this-is-what-fathers-do manner. What he did was work, and he let Jake see the work. On the third day, Jake appeared in the barn where Harlan was repairing a broken axle. He didn't offer to help. He just stood there. Harlan didn't look up. He said, "Hand me that wrench left side." Jake handed it to him. They worked in silence for an hour. At the end of it, Harlan wiped his hands on a rag and said, "You're not bad at keeping things level." Jake said nothing, but he came back the next morning. 3 days into the first week, Luke appeared at Harlan's side while he was checking the water level in the tower. Harlan had not asked for help. Luke did not offer it. He simply handed up the measuring stick. When Harlan's hand went out for it, the way you hand a man a tool he's been reaching for, Harlan checked the level. He said, "You watch things?" Luke said, "Yes, sir." "What do you see when you watch?" Luke considered this seriously. He said, "I see that you check the water tower every morning before the hands are up. I see that you always walk the east fence after supper. I see that you haven't been inside the room at the end of the hall since we got here." Harlan looked at him. Luke said, "I think that was your wife's room." Harlan said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You're right." Luke handed him the cap for the water line. He said, "My mama doesn't go into my father's workshop either. She says some rooms just need time." Harlan fitted the cap back on. He said, "Your mama's a wise woman." Luke said, "Yes, sir." And then he went back to whatever he'd been doing, and Harlan stood at the top of the water tower a moment longer than necessary, looking at the east fence line and the mountains beyond it. Sam was the complication no one had planned for. Not a difficult complication, the opposite. Sam was 6 years old and had not yet learned that trust was a thing you were supposed to give slowly and carefully with conditions attached. He followed Harlan everywhere. Harlan would walk from the house to the barn, and Sam would be 3 steps behind him, carrying nothing, offering nothing, simply present. Harlan would climb into the loft, and Sam would stand at the bottom of the ladder and shout useful information upward. "There's a cat up there. Luke said supper is almost ready, Mr. Wade. I lost my other boot. Have you seen it?" On the 5th evening, Sam fell asleep at the supper table. Harlan looked at him, head down, arms folded, entirely committed to unconsciousness, and then looked at Clara. Clara stood to go get him. Harlan said, "I'll carry him." Clara went still for a moment. Then she sat back down and said, "Second door on the left." Harlan lifted Sam the way you lift something you're trying not to wake. Sam's head dropped against his shoulder. Harlan carried him down the hall and laid him on the bed and pulled the blanket up. Sam didn't wake, but his hand in his sleep closed briefly around Harlan's thumb. Harlan stood there a second longer than was necessary. When he came back to the table, Clara was looking at her coffee cup. Neither of them said anything. Ben talked, Luke watched, Jake worked, Sam followed, and Clara cooked and cleaned and managed and organized. And every morning she woke before dawn and stood at the window of the room she shared with her 4 boys and looked out at the dark shape of the barn and the corral and thought, "This is a good place." She thought it, and then she thought about what the agency had told her and what she had told her boys and what she still had not confirmed with Harlan Wade. She had been trying to find the right moment for 10 days. There was no right moment. There was just the wrong one and then another wrong one. And then the days kept going. On the 11th day, Harlan found a letter on his desk. He had not put it there. His desk was in the small room off the kitchen he used as an office, and he had left it that morning with nothing on it but his account book and a broken pen. Now there was an envelope addressed to Clara Bennett already opened and set where he would see it when he came in. He did not read it. He set it on the corner of the desk and went to find Clara. She was in the kitchen doing something complicated with the good pot and a considerable amount of onions. The smell was extraordinary. He stood in the doorway. "There's a letter on my desk," he said. "Addressed to you." Clara turned. She looked at his face. Then she dried her hands on her apron and walked past him to the office. She picked up the letter and read it. Her face, while she read, did not do much. She had the kind of face that had learned to stay still. When she was done, she set the letter down. Harlan said, "Something wrong?" "No," she said. "Then yes. Mr. Wade, when you wrote to the agency in Denver, what exactly did you ask for?" Harlan was quiet for a moment. He said, "A housekeeper." Clara looked at him. "A widowed housekeeper," he said. "Fair wage, room and board." Clara picked up the letter and held it out to him. He took it. He read it. It was from the Denver Placement Agency, confirming that one Mrs. Clara Bennett had been matched with a suitable widower, Mr. Harlan Wade of Cheyenne County, Wyoming, for the purpose of a domestic arrangement with intent of marriage. With intent of marriage. Harlan set the letter on the desk very carefully. Clara said, "I told my boys we were going to a home. I told them there would be a man who needed a family." Harlan said nothing. "I told Sam." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She started again. "I told Sam he was going to have a ranch to grow up on." Harlan looked at the letter. He looked at the window. He looked at the floor. He said, "I'll write to the agency." Clara said yes. There was a silence. Clara picked up the letter and folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the kitchen. Harlan stood in the office alone for a full minute. Then he sat down at the desk and picked up the pen and put it back down. He thought about Sam's hand around his thumb. He thought about Jake in the barn handing up the wrench without being asked twice. He thought about Luke on the water tower saying, "Some rooms just need time." He thought about Clara at the window every morning before dawn, thinking whatever she thought about before the day started. He put the pen in the drawer. He did not write to the agency. Clara did not cry. She had learned not to years ago, and the practice had held. What she did was cook supper, and then she sat the 4 boys down. Harlan was out checking the east fence, and she explained to them quietly and plainly that there had been a misunderstanding about the arrangement, and that they were here as employees, not as family, and that they would stay through winter and find a new situation in the spring. Luke listened and nodded. Ben asked 5 questions, all practical. Jake looked at her for a moment and then looked at the table. He was very still, which was how he showed things. Sam said, "But I like it here." Clara said, "I know, baby." Sam said, "Does Mr. Wade know there was a misunderstanding?" Clara said, "Yes." Sam was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you ask him what he wants?" Clara said, "Tommy." Because Sam said with the complete logical certainty of a 6-year-old, "I don't think he wants us to go." Clara did not have an answer for that. She was still sitting with that thought when Harlan came back in from the fence line, cold and quiet, and said supper smelled good, and sat down at the table like a man who had made up his mind about something and wasn't planning to talk about it yet. 3 days after the misunderstanding was named, a second letter arrived. It came on the Thursday mail run brought out by Hobb, who handed it to Clara without ceremony and went back to the barn. Clara was on the porch with a basket of mending. She looked at the return address, a school in Laramie. She had written to them in August, before Denver, before Wyoming. She had written to 3 schools because she was a woman who made plans in parallel and did not put all her hopes in a single direction. The Laramie school was offering her a position. Classroom teacher, primary grades, and attached residence, 2 rooms sufficient for a mother and children, a salary that was, in fact, more than she was making at the ranch. They needed an answer by the end of the month. Clara sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. It was a good offer, better than good. It was stable and clean and the kind of thing she had trained for before she'd married William Bennett and put her training in a box and gone to be a farmer's wife. It was the kind of thing she had thought in her honest moments that she had closed the door on permanently. The end of the month was 11 days away. She did not show the letter to the boys. She did not tell Harlan. She put it in the bottom of her carpet bag under the winter stockings and tried to think clearly. This was harder than it should have been. The problem was the ranch, not Harlan specifically. She was trying to think about this without making it about Harlan. The problem was the rhythm of the place, the cold early mornings, and the particular quiet of the prairie at dusk, and the way the mountains looked at a certain hour. The problem was the bunkhouse hands who had started calling her ma'am like it meant something. The problem was the kitchen that she had made into a kitchen. The problem was that she had started to feel in her bones that this was home, and she was not supposed to. It had been made clear with complete kindness that she was here as an employee. She had not been hired to feel at home. She had not been hired to let her youngest son decide a man was his father. What she could not leave in the carpet bag was the weight of the decision itself. She had made hard choices before, real ones, the kind that don't reverse. She had decided when her husband died to keep all 4 boys fed and whole and moving forward, which had required a quality of will she hadn't known she possessed until she needed it. She was not afraid of decisions. She was afraid of this one because she could feel for the first time in 2 years that she wanted something not just for the boys, for herself. That was the dangerous part. 11 days. Harlan noticed she'd gotten a letter. He noticed because Harlan Wade was under his plainness a man who paid attention. He noticed what was in the yard and what wasn't. He noticed which horses were off their feed. He noticed with some accuracy when something had changed in his house. Clara had changed after the letter. She was still competent. She was still present, but there was a quality to her stillness that was different from before her stillness had been composed. Now it had something underneath it, something working. He didn't ask. It wasn't his business. She was his employee. He had established that with complete and total stupidity approximately 3 days ago. He thought about that conversation more than he wanted to. He thought about what he should have said. He had the list. It was not a short list. He had said, "I'll write to the agency." He had not said, "The arrangement as the agency described it does not sound like something I would object to." He had not said, "I did not write to the agency because I couldn't work out what to tell them." He had not said any of it because Harlan Wade had spent 41 years being the kind of man who did not say the thing until he was certain of the ground under his feet. And currently the ground felt considerably uncertain. Sam appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Wade." "Yep. Mama got a letter." "I know. She put it in her bag under the stockings." Harlan looked at him. "How do you know that?" Sam considered this. "I saw her put it there. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for my other boot." Harlan looked back at the fence line. Sam said, "Are you going to ask her about it?" "No." "How come?" "Because," Harlan said, "it's her letter." Sam thought about this with visible effort. Then he said, "Mr. Wade, I think you are a very stubborn man." Harlan said, "Yep." Sam nodded, satisfied with this confirmation, and went back to the house. On the 8th day before the letter's deadline, Jake came to find Harlan. He found him in the barn as usual. Jake had a way of appearing in the barn now as though he had always had reason to be there, as though he'd been coming here for years. Harlan had stopped noticing it in the way he'd stopped noticing the sound of the windmill. It had simply become part of the place. Jake sat on the hay bale and watched him work for a while. Then he said, "Mama S. been writing a letter." Harlan didn't look up. "Writing or reading?" "Writing, long one, she wrote it twice." Harlan set down the harness. "Jake said she cried a little last night. I don't think she knew I was awake. She never cries in front of us." Harlan was quiet. Jake said, "She's going to go." He said it simply, the way Jake said most things, like he'd worked it through and come out the other side. "She thinks she has to. She doesn't think she's supposed to be here." Harlan said, "What do you think?" Jake looked at his hands. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think Ben has stopped wetting the bed." Harlan blinked. He did it every night at the last two places, every single night. Mama thought it was a medical thing. Jake picked at a piece of straw. "He hasn't done it once since we got here, not once." Harlan had nothing to say to that. Jake stood. He said, "I'm not asking you to fix it. I just thought you should know." He moved toward the barn door and then stopped. "She's going to Laramie if that matters." He left. Harlan stood alone in the barn for a while. Outside, the wind was picking up. The mountains had clouds on them that would mean snow by morning. Winter was coming in, and it was coming serious, and there were things that needed doing before it arrived. And Harlan Wade was standing in his barn, unable to move because a 15-year-old boy had just told him something that had rearranged the inside of his chest. He picked up the harness. He put it back down. He went into the house. Clara was at the small writing desk in the kitchen. She had paper in front of her and a pen in her hand. She did not hear him come in, or if she did not turn. Harlan said, "Clara." She turned. She looked at him. Her eyes were level. He said, "The agency made a mistake." "Yes, but they weren't wrong about what I needed." Clara was very still. Harlan said, "I didn't write to them because I didn't know what to tell them, and I'm not a man who does this well." He stopped. He tried again. "This has been the best the house has been since my wife was alive, and that's not." He stopped again. He looked at the ceiling briefly, which was what he did when words weren't behaving. "I'm not talking about the house." Clara set down the pen. He said, "Wherever you're going, I can't stop you, and I won't try, but I want to know what you want. Not what makes sense, not what the letter says, what you want." Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "What do you want, Harlan?" He said, "You know what I want." She said, "I want to hear you say it." He looked at her. He said, "I want you to stay, all 5 of you, permanently as family." Clara looked at the paper in front of her. She looked at the window. She said, "Give me tonight." Harlan nodded. He went back to the barn. In the morning, Harlan came in for breakfast before first light. The kitchen was warm. The coffee was on. Biscuits were in the oven. Clara was not in the kitchen. Harlan poured his coffee. He stood at the window. After a while, he heard the back door, and Clara came in from outside, her shawl pulled around her, her breath showing in the cold. She looked at him. She was very calm in the particular way she got when she had decided something. He waited. She went to the stove and turned the biscuits. She said, "I wrote to Laramie." Harlan set down his cup. "I thanked them," Clara said, "and I declined." Harlan was quiet. Clara said, without turning from the stove, "I also wrote to the placement agency. I told them the arrangement stood." Outside, the first gray light was coming up over the eastern range. The horses in the corral were moving, beginning their morning. Somewhere in the barn, Harlan could hear one of the hands starting up. He said, "Clara." She turned. He crossed the kitchen. He took her face in both his hands, and he looked at her for a moment. Then he asked, "Aid, thank you," she said. "Don't thank me, I didn't stay for you." He raised an eyebrow. "Ben stopped wetting the bed," she said. Harlan laughed. It was not a sound that came out of him often, and it surprised them both. Clara looked at him like she was storing the sound of it somewhere. He kissed her on the forehead, a quiet, certain thing, and stepped back. "Breakfast in 20 minutes," he said. 15, she said. He went to the door. From the hallway came the sound of small feet, Sam up before the others, trailing his blanket, his hair a disaster of sleep. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them. He said, "Are we staying?" Clara looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at Sam. He said, "Get your boots on. I'll show you how to feed the horses before breakfast." Sam's face opened up all the way like a window thrown wide, and he dropped his blanket on the floor and went for his boots at a run. Clara watched Harlan pull on his coat. She said, "Harlan." He turned. She said, "We're staying." He held her gaze for one moment, then he turned and followed her son out the door. Outside, the sky was going gold at the edges. The mountains held their snow. The windmill turned. Some things are decided in a letter. Some things are decided in a kitchen at first light. And some things are decided the moment a boy holds up his arms and a man who had forgotten he was allowed to want things lifts him without thinking. That was how it started. That was how it stayed.